Good morning. Thank you very much for the introduction. Today, I will be speaking about research that I am conducting as part of my undergraduate thesis at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. Before I begin, I would like to take a moment to thank the organizers of the conference for extending such a warm welcome. In particular, I'd like to thank Dr. Johanna Alfreiter for her assistance with the logistics of my visit. I am deeply honored to have the opportunity to share my work and to attend these presentations. In presenting my work, I find it helpful to explain the development of this project, as I believe it provides valuable insight into my perspective as a researcher. At my university, I am a double major in computer science and art history. I am very interested in questions of the design of digital components such that they make experiences for users as productive as possible, while also considering the different factors that museum personnel must consider when deciding which types of digital components to select. I was drawn to study the ways that technology is used in the art museum because, as we've heard, like many other institutions, including libraries and archives, art museums are currently navigating the complex process of becoming digitized. In particular, I decided to focus on digital tools designed to be used by visitors, either in the gallery or online. I felt that visitor-facing technology was especially worthy of inquiry because of its great potential to impact a visitor's overall experience of the institution. Later in my research, I further specified my focus to the use of educational technology. In my study, I define educational technology to be any digital tool designed to help visitors learn more about the objects in a museum. Examples of what I classify as educational technology include audio guides, in-gallery videos, and online web pages with additional essays or artist statements. In developing my approach to studying educational technology in the art museum, I identified three main groups of interest. First, there are the technologists that develop and design these digital components, who then hand these tools off to museum personnel who are tasked with figuring out how to incorporate these digital components in the museum. And then finally, the third group that I envisioned was the visitors who would actually, or users who would be actually using these tools to help them learn and have a productive experience in the museum. I decided that before I could draw any meaningful conclusions about the impact of educational technology on visitor experience and engagement, I had to understand the motivations of the first two groups I mentioned, the technologists and the museum personnel. Through my coursework in computer science and my experience building web pages for clients, I felt that I had a working knowledge of the considerations that a technologist might have when working with an art museum. I was much less familiar with the perspective of curators, museum educators, and their strategies for incorporating technology in the museum. When I turned to literature to help illuminate the motivations of digital strategy in the art museum, I realized that many previous studies had focused on one particular exhibit or the efforts of one particular museum. While these studies were useful, I was curious to learn how digital education strategy might differ from institution to institution. I also wanted to explore if there were any similarities in digital education strategy among the museums, despite differences in size, location, and educational goals. To answer these questions, I utilized an ethnographic methodology and conducted a qualitative survey of 7 American art museums located on the West Coast of the United States. As part of my survey, I interviewed various members of staff at each site, including museum educators, digital media specialists, and curators. In addition, I collected observations at each site by placing myself into the role of the museum visitor, by walking through each gallery and noting instances where digital tools were used. Finally, I noted content that was available via each museum's website. After conducting this research, I found a number of similarities across these museums' digital strategies. The most significant similarity, I argue, is the tendency to include more digital tools in special exhibitions rather than in permanent exhibitions. While my study did not include a visitor research component, at the end of this presentation, I will offer some initial impressions of the impacts this pattern may have on visitor engagement, intellectual access, and learning outcomes. I suggest that this pattern may have unanticipated detrimental effects to visitor access to contextual information. A comparative analysis of the data collected from these 7 museums revealed a diverse number of approaches to digital strategy, even amongst similar institutions. However, there were some notable similarities among the museums included in the study. I will summarize my data by pointing to a few themes I saw across most, if not all, museums in the study. One similarity I encountered was the overwhelming use of 3 common formats: video, audio guides, and touchscreen interfaces. This chart represents the distribution I found of these 3 common digital formats in the galleries I visited. And just to note, so this chart is reflective of what I saw at the time of each of my visits. So you'll notice that the Halley Ford Museum doesn't have any boxes checked off, but I know from my interviews that they've used touchscreen interfaces in past special exhibitions. One aspect of the data that this chart doesn't fully capture is the popularity of video among museums in the study. At multiple places I visited, I saw video included in more than one location in the museum, often serving different functions at each location. Respondents I spoke with attributed their affinity for video to its versatility and the low overhead nature of the format. With minimal technical expertise and a projector, respondents expressed that their institutions could easily incorporate video in many different ways. To speak to the versatility of video, here I have 3 examples of how different museums use video to serve various educational ends. So starting here on the left, I have an image from the de Young in San Francisco where video was used in their special exhibition Cult of the Machine to provide contextual information about the early industrial period in the US. In the middle, I have an image from the Seattle Art Museum where video was used to share a statement from a Native American artist with visitors. And finally, at the Cantor Art Center at Stanford, video is used to explain the complicated lost wax casting process. And this was part of their permanent exhibition. They have a large collection of Rodin bronze sculptures. While these 3 examples are by no means exhaustive, they demonstrate the flexibility of video as a museum education tool. Respondents communicated similarly positive sentiments about the flexibility of touchscreen interfaces. However, I found these in galleries much less frequently. While this was not communicated explicitly, I infer that touchscreens were utilized less frequently, in part due to their cost and the necessity of specialized equipment, such as iPads or interactive kiosks. On the other hand, cost was explicitly mentioned by multiple participants with regard to audio guides. Many respondents indicated that the high cost of developing such tools either limited the number of exhibitions where this content was offered, or, in some cases, prevented their institution from using the format altogether. While these practical limitations generally impacted smaller institutions more significantly, respondents at every museum acknowledged that these realities dictated their use of digital education tools. I encountered very few digital tools that did not fall within one of these categories during my visits to each museum. I bring this pattern to your attention because of the motivations behind the decisions to use these tools. When I asked respondents what had prompted them to select certain formats above others, lack of resources was cited again and again. While the educational function of these formats, like the flexibility of video, was a consideration, the driving factor of these decisions were financial concerns. Another discernible pattern across all museums was a greater number of digital tools featured in special exhibitions. This tendency towards incorporating more digital technology in special exhibitions contributes to what I've termed the hierarchy of digital integration. I use the term hierarchy because, based on my observations, it would appear that when deciding where to incorporate digital technology in the museum, certain spaces, namely special exhibitions, were prioritized over others. This pattern, especially to those who work in or frequent art museums, is perhaps unsurprising. Special exhibitions are often the focal point of a museum as they typically drive revenue through admissions fees. As a result, especially at large institutions, special exhibitions are heavily advertised and subject to a great degree of attention from staff and visitors. With this in mind, it might make sense then that museums would allocate the limited resources they do have to develop educational technology towards special exhibitions. While much of my study was devoted to looking at the different types of technologies that were utilized and trying to understand why these tools had been selected, it is similarly important to recognize when and where digital content was not present, either in the galleries or online. To this effect, I saw very few instances of educational technology in permanent exhibition galleries. It is not that digital tools were not considered potentially useful in helping visitors interpret permanent collections, but rather it was the fact that making these materials available was prioritized below making content related to special exhibition objects available. Of course, there were exceptions to this pattern. However, generally, particularly for museums that were less digitally integrated overall, if there were any digital education tools in the museum, they were located in special exhibitions. In some cases, I saw contextual information that one might expect to find on a wall plaque next to a work migrated to online platforms and audio guides. When I talk about contextual information, I mean facts ranging from background knowledge related to the work's medium to specific details about the artist or time period. Here I have 3 different ways that museums use digital formats to provide contextual information. So actually it's 2 where they use digital formats. But so the first example I have on the left is an image from the Portland Art Museum. This is from their Picturing Oregon permanent exhibition, and they used the traditional format of a wall plaque, which contained textual information about the artists and the movements in the exhibition. In the middle, I have an image from a permanent exhibition at the dere, and I know it's difficult, I apologize for the image quality, but this was a place card that was located on the ground next to an armoire. It was a piece of furniture, and it's indicating to the visitor that, I think it's like, I forget what number, but there's a stop on the audio guide that corresponds, and it's letting them know that there's information that they can listen to instead of reading it. And just to note, at the dere, audio guides must be purchased for an additional $7 on top of admissions fees. And so again, on the right, my apologies for the poor image quality, but we can see at the Seattle Art Museum an example of contextual information provided via a mobile application. And so this image was taken from the same special exhibition I mentioned before, Double Exposure. The symbol next to the work's title and artist indicates that visitors can use the Layar Augmented Reality app to learn more about the piece. So the Layar app is free to download, but it does require the visitor to have a smartphone on which to view the information. And here the visitors hold their phone up to the work, and additional videos or text will appear on the screen superimposed over the work. Understanding patterns in digital education strategy is vital, as in this realm, digitization is inherently connected to the availability of contextual information. For visitors without a knowledge of art or art history, especially those who hope to learn something new by attending the museum, this contextual information is essential. Respondents at some institutions communicated that the decision to provide this information through digital formats rather than printed materials was motivated by a formalist approach to museum education. Formalist approaches to museum education aim to emphasize the aesthetics of the work and prioritize the visitor's uninterrupted interaction with the art object. According to some respondents, using a free audio guide, or any kind of audio guide, frees the visitor from the distraction of reading text, allowing them to better focus visually on the art. In these situations, respondents saw digital tools as helpful in creating a better overall learning experience. However, it is important to note that this is not a perfect system, as even with audio guides that are free of charge, visitors have to have smartphones or other devices in order to access this content, which limits how this information is available to visitors. In some cases, some of the museums that I looked at had designed their online web pages with the intention of visitors planning to plan their visit ahead of time and research objects of interest prior to setting foot in the museum. I saw instances where there was less contextual information available in the gallery, be it through any of the means I've discussed, so wall plaque or analog format, audio guide, or other digital components. There was less information in the gallery because it was located on the website, and there was this expectation that the visitors would seek that information out at a time when they were not inside the physical gallery. I've been mentioning cost a little bit, so perhaps it's a natural progression to move on to discuss that The impact of this hierarchy of digital integration is further complicated by the fact that at many institutions, access to special exhibitions is limited to visitors who pay an additional fee on top of the cost of general admission. So here I have a table of admissions prices of the museums that I looked at, and notice how at 3 of the largest institutions in the study, visitors have to pay more, sometimes significantly more, in order to see special exhibitions. And this is in US dollars. This is significant because in museums where contextual information is offered largely through digital components that are concentrated to areas that are restricted to those who pay more, the apparent effect is that contextual knowledge is limited unintentionally on a basis of the visitor's monetary contribution. In this situation, I see technology serving as an unintentional compounding factor in limiting the access of the visitor to information about the art. By this, I mean to say that technology itself is not what is limiting this intellectual access. Rather, I see the strategy of only using digital formats, or digital platforms to provide contextual information coupled with the lack of digital tools and permanent galleries as potentially detrimental to visitor engagement. I see these two patterns interacting together as having the potential to have differences in intellectual access where visitors with less knowledge of art history are disadvantaged, entrenching pre-existing social and educational divisions. Although I saw patterns to suggest that digitization might be limiting the ways in which visitors could access contextual information, I feel there is reason to believe that digital education may be able to create positive learning experiences in new ways that we can't even conceive of yet. Inherent in this discourse is a re-examination of the fundamentals of museum education. So in their article, Living in a Learning Society, Museums and Free Choice Learning, Falk, Dierking, and Adams examined the pedagogical shift of recent years that has changed the way that educators approach learning. They suggest that although pedagogical theorists have moved to favor a constructivist model of learning, in which the learner's individuality and how they understand information is emphasized, museum education practices have not necessarily followed suit and instead tend to stick more towards a behaviorist positivist style of learning. It's sometimes described as a one-size-fits-all or broadcast style of learning where the flow of knowledge is much more controlled by an authority figure. So like in a classroom, that'd be the teacher. In the museum sphere, the museum educator. Instead, so speaking on this, the authors write, many museum practitioners, consciously or unconsciously, operate as if by properly adjusting the lighting, composing the right label, and positioning an object just so, all visitors to the museum will emerge having had the same experience and having learned exactly the same thing. It's a bit critical, but viewing museum education as though it is one size fits all, they argue, is a faulty assumption, as the way a visitor approaches the museum is entirely dependent on a number of factors, including prior knowledge, experiences, and motivations. In other words, by approaching museum education in this way, we can ensure that certain visitors will be less engaged than others because just the nature of education, certain strategies will work better for some and not as well for others. So I see this as an area where technology can be of assistance, especially in providing a flexibility to meet the needs of this variety of different learning styles. As I mentioned, video was far and above the most popular digital format due to its versatility of uses. I think that this property should be further developed in future digital education tools in order to engage a potentially broader audience. I can envision many ways in which digital tools might help visitors control their learning experience, effectively kind of creating this constructivist learning in the museum. I see, something even as simple as being able to select different types of audio content or different options on a touchscreen. Those are all ways in which the visitor can kind of control their educational experience. In embracing flexible digital tools that allow visitors more control over their learning, I see an opportunity for institutions to welcome a greater number of people, including those who don't know very much about art, because by giving them the control, you're allowing those who know less of the contextual details to seek that information out for themselves. I believe that with an awareness of the factors that I've discussed today, including the hierarchy of digital integration, museum educators and technologists alike can intentionally use digital integration strategies to encourage productive learning in the museum. And I would like to clarify that I'm not suggesting that these impacts that I'm discussing can be addressed by adding more technology to permanent exhibitions, I don't think that that's necessarily a positive thing or the answer to the questions that I'm raising, but rather I argue that digital strategy must really deeply consider the potential impacts it has even in spaces of the museum that aren't digitally integrated, and kind of really consider how, visitors experiencing the museum, how you're providing consistent messaging and providing this information, even if it isn't an analog format. How does that tie into the way that they received information in another space that potentially was digitally integrated? Especially as museums continue to work to diversify their visitor base, as a field, it is important to continuously ask ourselves how our approach to education is reflective of the audiences we wish to reach. Technology, I believe, has the opportunity to contribute positively towards welcoming new audiences, although based on trends I observed during this study, it also has the power to further entrench educational divisions. As I described previously, I believe the higher overall level of digital integration in special exhibitions has significant unintentional impacts on the learning experience of museum visitors. This is particularly true at institutions that have minimal contextual information in the gallery to begin with, due to the migration of these resources to an online platform that is not accessible within the physical gallery. In these instances, I saw technology as a compounding factor in certain aspects of a formalist approach to museum education practices, in that less information was offered to visitors at the museum because it was available on the website. The clear next step in this work is further research focused on visitor experiences in the museum and measuring the impacts of existing educational technology. It is vital to integrate the museum in such a way that is considerate not only of the needs who already visit the museum, but of those who we hope to welcome in the future. Thank you.